How's it going? I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy, organizational psychologist and best-selling author of multiple books. My books are on cutting-edge psychology and high performance, as well as entrepreneurship. And in this really interesting and unexpected conversation, we went places I've never... I shared some things I didn't think I would share. One of them being the origin story and my views of God. And honestly, my belief of the origin story of all people, that we all lived with God before we came here. I share a lot of my own beliefs about God and about how those beliefs lead me to being an entrepreneur and pursuing the big, crazy, impossible things that I do. We also had a conversation around the difficulty and the social pressure of letting go of your past self, letting go of the things that got you here but won't get you there towards your 10x future self. And finally, I walk you through a really interesting process of looking at your own prior 10x stages. We've all gone 10x many times. And I share with you a mindset or a framing so that when you look at your past a certain way, you actually will see that you've actually gone 10x many times. You've transformed yourself through big commitments. And I show you how you can identify the crucial 20% using the 80-20 principle, the crucial 20% of your former 10x jumps that allowed you to get here so that in the future you can have a far more intrinsically motivating, exciting 10x future. Talk to you later.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty podcast. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Now, as we work towards our goals and our outcomes, it's not uncommon to believe that when I get there, I'll be happy, or when we get there, it'll all be different. But what most people sadly find is that their achievements of their goals is in and of itself kind of an anti-climax. You see, if we believe that the outcome will make us happy, every achievement is more deeply embedded in misery. However, if we can discover how to fall in love with the process, no one can take away our joy, because it is the journey that transforms us, not the outcome. So what might happen if you took that heroic journey? That's where we're going on the next 2 episodes as we examine why 10xing your life is easier than 2xing it, particularly if you're guided there by your future self. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please get yourself over to wherever it is you tune into the podcast from, and do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It really helps, and we really appreciate it. Special shout out to everybody who is a regular listener. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive right in. In the online world of social media, there's been a mantra that's been all about content, and it's been that content is king. However, if you are a regular listener, you have heard me say many times, content is not king. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's context that's the real monarch. Well, what's the real sort of practicality of context, and how can it assist you expanding your experiences to be 10x? And when I say that, more than you've ever imagined. Well, let's find out together. Our guest for the next 2 episodes is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. No, I didn't say Bane, not Tom Hardy of Batman. Dr. Benjamin Hardy is an organizational psychologist who has become the world's leading expert in psychology of entrepreneurial leadership and exponential growth. His Ph.D. research focuses on entrepreneurial courage and transformational leadership. Before completing his Ph.D., his blogs were read by over 100 million, that's with an M, million people, and he published his first major book, Willpower Doesn't Work, and he was and he's while running a 7-figure online training business. He finished his Ph.D. in 2019. Dr. Hardy has published 5 additional books, including 3 authored with the legendary entrepreneurial coach Dan Sullivan. His books have sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and he is a sought-after speaker, teacher, and corporate and entrepreneurial events, as well as for Fortune 500 companies. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome Dr. Benjamin Hardy. And the crowd goes wild, young man.
And the crowd goes wild. I love it.
Good to have you, mate. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us.
This is a really cool introduction. Happy to be with you.
Let's dive in with a place I always like to dive into, because I think that, we've got these strategies and everybody's got a new idea about how to do something, but my whole philosophy is that nothing happens without some level of meaning, or nothing happens that will continue to drive us without meaning. What is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
So I'm gonna take you a direction I don't know if you're gonna be comfortable with, and I don't know your audience is gonna be comfortable with.
I promise you I'll be comfortable.
So my belief system is that my origin story, and I have never talked about this on a podcast, but I just like the question. I love the origin story question.
Thank you.
So my origin story is that I would typically go into my 11-year-old self and that my parents got divorced and stuff like that. And that stuff's really important. But if I'm actually thinking about what's the origin story that gives my life meaning, it's the fact that I lived with God before I came here and that I chose to experience this life, which is a really transformational journey. And that I'm a child of God. One of my favorite concepts or quotes is that as God now, hopefully this can be edited. One of my favorite concepts or quotes is, as man now is, God once was, and as God now is, man may become. So I believe that this life is education, it's experience, and that context of knowing I lived with God before I came here, and I chose to come here for education and learning, gives my life enormous meaning.
Beautiful. So let me ask, can we go a bit further down that road? Is that okay with you?
You go wherever you want to go. I mean, I wasn't planning on talking about that, but it was such a great question.
Okay. So when you think about that, is that something that you feel like you've always known, or is that something you came to? That understanding
both.
Of having...
It was probably both. I was certainly taught that, and I also deeply studied it. But I think that I do think that you can have rememberings of prior life. And so, yeah, I think the answer is both. I think that I probably always knew, but in a lot of ways I studied, I learned, I opened myself up. I've had spiritual experiences, developed a relationship with God, and just continue to learn and expand my perspective and unlearn former perspectives. And so, yeah, I think it's a combination of two.
So when you think about, and again, I certainly wasn't planning on going down this road either, which is great. I always love that. So when you think about because the God, Gut from German, has many faces in the context of the world that we live in, that we see, is God Zeus? Because modern traditional Judeo-Christian religion has had God as looking a lot like Zeus, a long-haired, long-bearded white man in the sky. I doubt that that's your concept. When you think about the form of God and talking about that you were with God before you chose to come here, so there's this soul with a cognition, there's a soul with a
100%
choice. So when you think about God in that context, talk to us what you mean by God, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so there's a few different sources I could cite, but even if I just use the Bible as one source,
sure,
talks about how we are the offspring of God. We're made in the image of God, right? And so I think if I'm looking at you as a person, if I was looking at God, I would see someone quite similar.
Right.
Maybe a far more elevated and evolved version. That goes straight back to the idea that we are literally the offspring or children of God. I think there's a really great quote from Marianne Williamson, who said something along the lines of, your playing small doesn't help the world, and that you are a child of God. And that the more you actually just realize that truth, you can't hate yourself, like, and you couldn't hate anyone else as well, and that you actually are a divine being. So my belief is that God, is a more evolved version of us, and that he has a body, right? Not that he, like, it would be more of like a eternal, but that goes back to the idea of as man now is, God once was, and as God is, we may become. So God went through his own progression at some point, and we are literally the children of God, and we're going through a similar experience to gain education and experience. It's similar to how I see it as sending a kid off to college, right? Like they've got to go off and they've got to learn. And I love the book, If Life is a Game, These Are the Rules. Have you read that book by chance?
I have.
Yeah, I think one of them is like, you will get a body, right? And another one is you will learn lessons. And another one is lessons are repeated until learned. There are no mistakes, only lessons, right? And you're going to forget all this when you're born. And so I just think life is education, and we get to, it's on all of us to go through our own developmental process, and we certainly can help each other.
So how does that foundation, because it is a foundation for you, I'm hearing it as a foundation anyway, how does that foundation impact you? Let's just go as an entrepreneur first, because you are a social scientist, and yes, you've done all, you got your Ph.D. and you write all these great books, but you are also sort of at heart an entrepreneur. How does that meaning impact that?
I think at heart, I'm actually a learner. Entrepreneurship was just an organic outcome of development, learning, and seeking transformation of myself, and hopefully providing opportunities for value in the world. Entrepreneurship came out of my desire for learning and development and education. So I guess from that standpoint, would you restate the question about entrepreneurship?
Well, yeah. I mean, so as an entrepreneur now, how do you pull that meaning into that? How do you thread that through into entrepreneurship? If you are a child of God and that you chose to be here for your own evolution and potentially for the evolution of others, or facilitation of the evolution of others, how do you pull that into the entrepreneurial journey and in serving the clients that you serve?
Yeah, I think it's always in the background. I mean, it influences the goals I set. Certainly, I'm not that limited in the goals I set, because I believe things are possible. I believe in the power of faith and things like that. And I also the power of the mind, right? I believe human beings are amazing. So I guess it definitely helps me to be thoughtful about my own thoughts and about what I think about, thoughtful about the information that comes into my head, thoughtful about the people I'm around. In terms of entrepreneurship, I think I'm a big believer in choice. Obviously, choices are constrained by context. You brought up the power of context. If I was born in a different period of time or a different point in the world, maybe I wouldn't be an author and writing books. Who knows? Maybe I'd have a different set of goals and things like that. But given today's environment, given the world, it just made sense. During my undergrad, I was studying more theoretical psychology, more philosophical psychology, just big ideas and understanding how science works and how human beings work. When I went into my Ph.D. program, which was in organizational psychology, I was very interested in entrepreneurship by that point. I was not an entrepreneur, but I started studying. When you do a Ph.D., you work under an advisor who's an expert in some form of psychology. And I started working under one of the top researchers in the world on the psychology of courage. She's been studying courage for 20 plus years. And so I wanted to understand courage on the psychological level. And I applied that to my research on entrepreneurship. Specifically, I was studying the difference between wannabe entrepreneurs and real entrepreneurs. And I was, this was right at the exact same time as well as I started studying Dan Sullivan's work, because I was very much ready to become an entrepreneur. I was in the first year of my PhD program. I wanted to understand courage. I wanted to also understand entrepreneurship and just the relationship between these two. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think everyone who has my faith background is obviously going to become an entrepreneur, but for me, it's just it's a really beautiful vehicle for doing meaningful work. Back to the idea of origin story and meaning. I find it very meaningful for myself. I find the work that I can do meaningful, and I find that there's infinite upside. Like I'm a lot more free as an entrepreneur in how I spend my time and in what I direct my mind toward, and the projects I pursue, and in the impact I can have. And so I love what entrepreneurship affords. And it stretches me. It makes me a leader. I've got to build a team and be a better leader. And so it just affords a lot of really cool opportunity.
It's really interesting, man, because when you talk about this, of course, I know you don't know that side of my background, but I traveled the world to study with different spiritual masters. I studied Vedanta, which is Hindu philosophy, Buddhism, the Tao, Gnostic and Coptic Christianity, as well as Kabbalah. And so I was deeply embedded in the spiritual world for a very long time, before psychology, before quantum physics, and before neuroscience. So, because I'm a polymath, but that's the foundation. And for me, I think that, I privately work with a lot of clients from very different backgrounds. And they say, I'm not sure if I want to do this. And I go, well, I don't want it to interfere with my faith. And I say, if your faith is your faith, not something you adopted from somebody, not something that was indoctrinated into you, but it's yours, it will get stronger, not weaker. If it's not yours, it will probably get weaker because you'll be looking at things in a way you haven't before. And so when you get to that, it's very interesting to me, because if you're embedded in deep meaning, whatever that is for you, well, of course you're more courageous. Of course, your psychology is more driven towards courage, and it's also driven towards more freedom. And so if it's driven towards more courage and more freedom, entrepreneurship seems to be a pretty obvious path, right? So I want to be courageous. I want to be free. I don't want to be restricted by the system, or whatever the system is. And I need to be courageous in order to do that. That's part of my eulogy. I have my own life eulogy, and part of my eulogy is about living in courage, because if I don't do that, I've not fulfilled my life's purpose. So to me, it's just, when you were talking about it, I was thinking, oh my God, it's so aligned with that. So, but now let's just sort of take a sidebar on that. This was not at all where we were going to go, but take a sidebar on that. And I'm going to sort of put this forward to you. Yeah, we can all be very loving. I'm a spiritual guy. I can be a very loving guy, but I'm also very sort of boots on the ground, practical guy too. I'm not a woo spiritual guy. And the world of entrepreneurship in America often has, what's the nice way of putting it? A lot of
just say it as directly as you can.
Cheesy, greedy bastards involved in it, who are on a plane with girls with their tits pushed up on a bra, and on a private jet with their fancy cars.
Just so you know, I think that is the image of the extremes. I think that's less than 1% of entrepreneurial America. I think
I agree with you.
A 1% extreme and an image that doesn't represent the reality for 99%
that's my point,
of entrepreneurs.
Though, is that I agree with you. I don't think it is, but I think it's what's sold. That's my point.
I agree.
Right? And so every 20-something-year-old is going, I want to fly on a private jet. I want girls around me with their boobs pushed up. I want a Lamborghini or whatever it is. I like to walk through this guy's garage and have it as mine. And to me, this is my opinion, not the truth.
No, go ahead, please.
So I'll be really clear. To me, entrepreneurship, or for that matter, any work, it's my opinion, is service. And if I'm in service of my ego and my cars in my garage, then I'm going to be what I was talking about at the beginning, which is I'm going to be deflated while having everything that I should have, and feel deflated and anticlimactic with my life, rather than touching the lives of others. Because for me, I say this to people all the time, if you can give something to somebody, what would you give them? And they go, well, I don't know. And I say, there's something you can give any human being you meet. Any human being you meet. And they go, what's that? And I go, dignity. And they go, what do you mean by dignity? Not seeing them for their circumstance, but seeing them for what I call their soul. Seeing them for their soulful selves. Not seeing them because they have a Bentley and then suddenly fumbling over your words. And not seeing them as a homeless person and trying not to look at them and make them invisible. But see them from a place of dignity. And that is how you begin to serve the world.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. I think that's beautiful. And I think I've heard it said in this, we mentioned Joe Polish earlier.
Yeah.
He's a good friend, and he says that he judges people not based on how they talk to those who are socially perceived to be above them, but for how they talk to someone who is perceived to be socially below them. So, for example, it could be the waiter at the bar or the janitor. And so you can learn a lot about someone by observing their interact. Of course, when they're around people who are in the social hierarchy perceived to be above them, they're going to be really humble and on their best behavior. But how are they when they're talking to the assistant or to the person who's cleaning the toilets?
Absolutely. So
it says a lot about someone.
So when you think about that, you think about all those things, it's very easy, particularly based on the context of what we've just talked about, because I want to make sure that people get the truth here, or the truth as best we can relay it. Is that when we talk, your book is about, you've got a couple of books right now that are out, but, stepping into this future self right now, this is not some woo-woo conceptual thing. This has got a lot of hard science behind it. And a lot of the problem is in this dignity thing that I talked about is that we're dragging our old self with us all the time. If you come from my background, which is growing up in poverty and violence and crime and addiction and all those other things, and your background and your mom and dad getting divorced and whatever happened in your childhood, it's very easy. In fact, it's more than easy. It's part of the emotional source code of that individual to drag that into the present and then project it into the future. My quote is, the past is always present in your future and is about to poison you. The past is always present and is about to poison your future. So your past is always leaking it from your present into your future. So talk to us about how do you sort of separate that and go, hold on a sec, because there's that part of us in our brain, our own cognitive bias that is saying, yeah, but I'm not that. I could never be like Ben. I could never get a Ph.D. I could never adopt kids. I could never live in Florida. I could never write books. I could never, whatever it is. And of course, we know it's not true. But how do you, from your point of view, how do you get that out of the way to step into this idealized or better version of future self?
Such a mondo question.
Sorry,
question.
Mate.
I'll do my best. No. I love it. I'll do my best to keep my thoughts simple, and then you can follow up wherever you want to go. Number one, from a psychological standpoint, your quote is gorgeous. From a psychological standpoint, the past, present, and future cannot be separated.
Absolutely.
Time is not sequential or call it chronological in terms of psychology. Time is holistic, meaning it's all happening now. Even Albert Einstein said, as a physicist, he knows that the dividing lines between the past, present, and future are an illusion. So this is really crucial to realize that who you're being in the present is entirely based on your views of your narrative of the past and also your views of your future self. So basically, your present, as is now constituted, is simply a reflection of what you think about your past and your future. And so to have a powerful present, generally in a really simple way, means you have a quality, positive past, irrespective of what actually occurred.
Yes.
A past that you're learning from and grateful for, and that you're experiencing lots of growth and meaning out of, and then a future that is extremely purposeful and compelling. And Viktor Frankl obviously wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He would quote Nietzsche all the time, which is, when the why is strong enough, you can bear anyhow. And so this then leads to a lot of the research on future self, which is becoming a predominant topic in psychology. I actually was writing a book called Personality Isn't Permanent back in 2019. And I fell upon all the research on future self. I didn't even know about this research. And then I started falling upon it and realized there's actually a lot of research on this topic. And it's been studied for at least 20 years pretty in-depthly. There's a lot of hard TED Talks on it from Harvard psychologists, et cetera. But I would say that some of the basic premises, and then we can go wherever you want with this. Some of the basic premises of this research are, number one, as human beings, we are very pulled and driven by our views of the future, whether positive or negative. If you have a non-hopeful, non-purposeful view of your future, then in the present, you're not going to be very motivated. And that's exactly what Frankl literally said. He said, when people lost hope and meaning and a sense of goal and purpose for their future, they could not handle the difficulties of the concentration camps. And so who you're being right now is very much directly impacted by your views of your goals towards and your commitment of your future.
Yes.
So that's one. Number two is that your future self is far different than you expect. Your future self is a different person than you. Call it even in 12 months from now, your future self is going to be in a different place. They're going to have had a lot of experiences you don't have. They're going to know things you don't know. They're going to care about things you don't care about. And so like, just as if you really take time to reflect on who you are versus your past self a year ago or 5 or 10 years ago, you're not the same person. You're not operating with the same mindsets, beliefs. You don't have the same goals. You now know things. You have a different vision of your future. So, yeah, I guess just to keep it very simple, and then you go wherever you want. Future self is very important. All the research shows that the more connected you are to your future self, both long-term and short-term, the better decisions you make in the present, financially, in terms of health, in terms of friends, in terms of choices. You're just going to make a lot better decisions if you're connected to your future self.
However, I want to make sure people understand what you're talking about when you say future self, because the key factor here is that future self must be elicited, pulled from you, rather than reactive, because most people's future self is their present self, based on their past. So they go, Amen. I want to get to, I said, well, what's your vision of you in the future, Dov? I'd say, or whoever it is. And they say, well, listen, Dov, it's just me. It's incremental, right? And it's not really that different. And I will use the exercise you just talked about with, I'll tell a story or whatever it might be. Here's how you're so different. Yes, I can see that, but there's no dividing line about this victimhood that I'm living in or I lived in, to becoming more independent in my thinking. It's very hard for people to grasp this idea of how do I separate from pulling the entrails of my history into this future projection. So when you talk about my future self, I don't know what that is most people's response.
You are dead right. You are so right. It's exactly what the researchers find as well, is that most people don't spend very much time thinking about their future self. They literally haven't. They might be sort of thinking about certain goals, like I want to retire at certain ages and stuff. And of course, those goals are driving their behavior. But you're absolutely right that for the most part, most people aren't thinking about their future self, meaning the person they're going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They're just not thinking about who that person actually is. Dr. Daniel Gilbert, who gave a famous TED Talk on the subject, he's a Harvard psychologist, been studying this for 20 years. He gave a TED Talk in 2014 on the main stage called The Psychology of Your Future Self. Mm-hmm. And a lot of his research is very interesting. And this goes back to your future self is very different than you think. But most people, because they're not thinking about their future self very much, and they're also not genuinely reviewing their past self very regularly, where I actually can tell you I'm quite a different person than I was even a month ago. Sure. Because I've learned a lot, but I'm regularly referencing my past self. I'm regularly distinguishing how I think now versus how I thought a month ago or even a week ago. Mm-hmm. And so I can see the changes in real time. But most people, because they're not thinking about their future self and they have a present past orientation, they assume that for the most part, who they are right now is who they're always going to be. That's called Absolutely. The end of history illusion in psychology. And so most people, they just think that, for the most part, I'm the finished product. Actually, he has a great quote where he says, human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. Mm-hmm. And so most people, it's a cognitive bias. Exactly. Most people think that who they are right now is for the most part who they're always going to be, that they're going to have the same preferences in the future. They're going to have the same goals, the same values, the same beliefs, the same friends. Truth is they're not.
Right. So it's really about challenging those ideas. And, and this is one of the things I talk about with therapy, and why I think therapy is important is because to quote Heisenberg, Werner Heisenberg, when we observe something, it is changed and we are changed by observing it. And so for me, therapy is a great example of that quantum quote, is the observing of it changes it. And particularly if you come at it from the context that I know you do based on what you just told me and what I know I do, which is This was my teacher. This was my classroom. It sucked. It sucked large. And I'm not going to deny that pain, and I'm not going to downplay it. It had impact and it caused scars, but it is a leverage point. It is a fulcrum to something more magnificent that I needed in order to be able to serve in the way that I serve. But I've got to look at that past and say, where's the lesson first that got me to here? And what's the lesson here to get me to there? Is that where you're coming from?
100%. The past is there to be learned from, not lived in. And so like everything in the past is useful. Of course, as long as you use it. And so like, as an example, I was just journaling this morning and I was comparing my January of 2023 to my January of 2022. And just genuinely reflecting on what's my baseline as a person, what's my vision right now compared to my vision before. Also, like, what are the actions and behaviors that I'm seeing my current self versus my past self? And I was just a genuine comparison of January versus January. And to be honest with you, like, I mean, I was in a great place, right? I mean, I actually finished writing the Future Self book in January. So there were some big wins, but I also made a lot of stupid decisions. I lost a lot of money on some dumb crypto projects and stuff like that. And it's not that I was also distracted. And I could be mad at my past self, or I could just say that that's where my past self was. And there's no value in being angry at your former self. You get absolutely nothing from it. Being mad at your past self does nothing to propel your future self. All you can do is simply acknowledge it and learn from it. And so like I because of what I've learned, my future self is massive compared to my past, because I'm now better. I'm not bitter because of what happened. But I think one of the challenges that people have is because, let's just say, they made various mistakes or things that just didn't go their way. And this goes back to your quote, about a past, is always in the present that poisons the future. This is when you're continuing to be either mad at yourself or mad at other people for what happened and wishing things were different right now than they are. If I could go back, and I think this is true of everyone who learned a lot in the last 12 months, if I could go back and relive 2022 with the knowledge I now have, I'd be able to freaking create insane results over that year.
Right.
But I can't go back, and I don't regret anything I did. That just is a demonstration that I learned a lot. And now the question becomes, based on that, what's possible for me if I live better in the future? And so you just can learn from it, and you just give your former self compassion and empathy. And one thing that's really beautiful is knowing that your future self is going to give you enormous compassion and empathy. My future self is so much nicer to me than I am to myself. My future self freaking loves me. My future self values and appreciates me and understands my weaknesses and is completely empathetic and caring towards me. And so I can tap into that, and then I can recognize that I'm not stuck the way I am. I know I can change and improve and evolve, and I don't need to be perfect, and I can just move forward. And so it's a beautiful process.
So we're already at the end of part one of the show. And nice. I want to say that, in part two, I want to talk about the practicality of this and the application of this in 10xing your life. But I want to leave you, listener, viewer, with this thought that if you're not actively creating this future self, then you're drifting into something that is going to carry all the echoes of history with you, and moreover, the echoes of other people's history that you've taken on in their ideas and their beliefs and in the resonance of your family history or whatever it might be, rather than actually creating it, being the artist that sculpts your own life. If you read Benjamin's new book about how you can 10x your life is easier than 2xing it. It starts with one of my favorite stories, which is Michelangelo and the carving of David, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a beautiful story.
Doesn't get much better than that. Does not get much better than that.
It doesn't get better than that. And when the Pope asked Michelangelo, how were you able to create this magnificent piece of art, which is David? And he says, I just had to take everything else away. And, it's understanding that my clients will often say to me, I've learned so much from you, but I feel like I have less than I had before. And I say, thank you. That's the greatest compliment you could give me. Because what you've learned from me is the chisels that have knocked away everything else to reveal your magnificence, to reveal your deep greatness, your soulful self. And so we're going to talk about how you can step into that in part 2 of the show. It's amazing to have you here, Ben, with us. Please tell our listeners and our viewers where they can find out more about you, about your services, about your books, whatever it is you want to let them know about.
A few simple places. One is benjaminhardy.com, my name, benjaminhardy.com. One is futureself.com. And then just from there, I have a YouTube channel where I teach various ideas. And certainly, I think a great place to start is just simply reading one of the books, whether that's Be Your Future Self Now, 10X is Easier Than 2X, and others.
Yeah. And Ben's writing style is really easy for you to get into. It's very well done. I know you're going to love it. We're going to be back in just one click. Until then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the future of you that you haven't even considered yet, that is so freaking magnificent that it's going to blow your mind to just get a look at it. And that's where we're going in part 2. We'll see you very soon. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.